The European economy is stagnating. We're losing competitiveness in terms of technology and cost of energy. The green transition is stalling because it is costly and we lack raw materials. At the same time, Russia continues to wage an aggressive war against Europe, outperforming us in an arms race. Today, we'd like to explore how the EU can reconcile these challenges while remaining true to its values. My guest is Ann Mettler, Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Columbia University, and probably the only person who was a top advisor to both Bill Gates and Jean-Claude Juncker. Welcome, Ann.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
If I try to summarize your career, it will take quite a while. You started at the private sector, then founded your own think tank and joined the European Commission at a very senior level. Now you're back to the private sector. How would you briefly introduce yourself?
As quite multifaceted, maybe a little undisciplined. In a nutshell, my career started at the World Economic Forum, where I served as a Europe director. But my heart was in Brussels, so I quit that job to move to Brussels to start a think tank called the Lisbon Council, which wanted to support the then Lisbon agenda, which was the original competitiveness agenda. And I did that for 11 years until Jean-Claude Juncker invited me into his team. I became a director general at the European Commission. I ran the internal strategy department for 5 years, then left to work for Bill Gates. As you said, I opened up an office for Breakthrough Energy, which is the vehicle through which he does his climate and clean tech work. And that came to an end earlier this year. And now, as you said, I'm a distinguished visiting fellow at Columbia University. And I'm also in the process of starting a new organization that will work on the energy transition, but perhaps from a little different perspective, more from a security, resilience, competitiveness, industrial policy perspective. So that's very much in the works. Just to say, for 20 years of my life, I basically worked on digital technologies. Then when it became clear that Europe was not going to be a leader in digital, I decided to move into clean tech and wanted to work in making Europe a global leader in clean technologies. And that experience has been somewhat sobering and has also informed my sort of opinions about competitiveness at this stage.
How did your experience in the private sector affect your work at the Commission? Was there anything that struck you in the Commission working culture?
Well, the private sector is, first of all, there is no private sector, right? I mean, it's very multifaceted, whether you speak to someone who works in investment or someone, a CEO who leads a multinational or a startup entrepreneur. So I would say there is not the private sector. However, the private sector needs to always remain on the ball. It can't, it is always facing competition. And that, I think, is a little different when you're in the public sector, where you're very much shielded oftentimes from economic realities, right? So you usually don't lose your job when the economy tanks. You just don't face the same constraints that the private sector does. That's certainly one grave difference, is that the private sector at any given moment feels a lot of pressure.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about Europe's competitiveness and growth. The EU's growth in 2023 was around 0.4%, and in 2024, it was around 1%. And the gap with the US and especially China has widened in the last decade. What are these reasons for this relative economic decline? And why do you think that European companies are finding it hard to scale up globally? Is this because of overregulation? Is it lack of risk capital? Is it market fragmentation or something deeper?
Yeah. So this is very important to understand. Europe's competitiveness problems didn't start yesterday. I mean, a lot of people are, pretending now this started 1 or 2 years ago. No. When I came to Brussels in 2003 to set up the Lisbon Council, it was because Europe already then was a laggard. So that's very important to understand. These are very deep-seated, long-standing challenges that we not only have not been able to overcome, but that have really deepened with time. Here, I think it's very helpful to not only look at sort of GDP figures, because they can be very abstract, but just to say on GDP, as a side note, that one of the real difficulties we're facing in Europe is that the German economy is no longer performing. So Germany now had 2 consecutive years of no growth, and that 23, 24, and now I would say 2025 is also looking very shaky. And that's, of course, the largest economy in Europe. It used to be a very successful exporter. So this on the European economy. But what I always encourage is not just to look at sort of the macro data, but really at firm level data, because it's companies that are an expression of economic performance. And here it's really, frankly, very sobering. At the turn of the century, 41 of the world's top 100 companies were European. This included, at the time, the UK and also Switzerland, even if Switzerland, of course, was never in the EU, but so a very broad notion of European. However, 41 out of 100 at the turn of the century, today we're down to 18. Yeah, so that's very serious. That's in the course of 25 years. And of course, the only challenge we have is not only that these large companies are coming under increasing pressure, but that we're not scaling new companies, right? So again, if you look at startups, Europe has not produced a single deep tech startup that has a market cap above 100 billion euros and is listed in Europe in more than 50 years. Yeah. So this is a really poor performance. And this is why, since we are now focused on competitiveness, please, 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 the European Commission, DG ECFIN, we need to work much more with firm level data. We need to work much more with microeconomic data. This is really important, because that's where it's happening.
Well, is this failure linked to lack of investments? Mario Draghi has estimated that we need around 800 billion euros annually in investment to revive growth. How realistic is this figure, and what would be the smartest way to mobilize both the public and private investments?
Yeah. So I actually had the privilege of asking Mario Draghi this question, because I was also wondering, where does this enormous figure, I mean, 800 billion per year, come from? And basically what the Draghi team did is they looked at all the EU programs, the Digital Decade and the Green Deal, and added it all up and came to this figure of 800 billion, which I don't think is a realistic figure. And I think it is misleading in the sense that if we only spend enough, then somehow we will succeed. I've been around a long time. I have seen tens, if not hundreds of billions of euros spent on digital priorities, green priorities. Remember, when the Green Deal was launched, the goal was to spend 1 trillion euros over the next decade. We're now 5 years into this. So the point is just spending without any understanding what's the measure of success, right? Is, for me, frankly, is not good policy. And I think that on balance, what Brussels has delivered for the investments it has made is comparatively poor. I think that finance ministers would be more open to spending if we had, we were global leaders in digital technologies or in clean tech. But as it is, I have my doubts around this figure, I'll say very openly.
The EU has been priding itself as the regulatory superpower, but now we're seeing a U-turn, a deregulatory agenda, which sparks a lot of controversy in Europe. The EU seems to be facing the dilemma, either simplify regulation to boost competitiveness or uphold its core values. But is there really a tension between the two? And how do you see the debate on the Omnibus legislation proposed by the Commission?
So that's a very meaty question. The first thing to say about regulation, more regulation is not better, right? I mean, I have had on occasion the feeling that regulation has become basically occupational therapy for policymakers and frankly also for a lot of people in town. And I've seen policymakers come, every 5 years, like, what do I get to regulate, right? Because it's basically through regulation that you put yourself on the map, you become important. And it's frankly, it's much easier than building conducive ecosystems, crowding in private sector investment and making things happen in the real economy, right? So I actually think that sort of this Brussels effect, which was basically this notion that all the world's best rules are made in Brussels, um, has turned into what I now call a Brussels curse. I think it has been very, very unfortunate that Arno Bradford gave the Brussels this idea that this was our job. Sort of, if you looked at who did what in the global economy, that it was the role of the EU to draw up rules.
Mm.
And I say that because rules, you know, they don't function in isolation. They don't function in the absence of a vibrant corporate sector, right? I mean, so much is said about standards, but who sets the standards? The standard is set by the companies that get to deploy their technologies, right? So standards are set in global standardization bodies where Europe now has completely, I mean, is not represented the way we used to be, right? So, plus, speaking about rules, we have not really used our own markets to enforce these regulations in a level way. So we have always put more burdens, regulatory burdens, on our own companies. Everything that is produced in Europe is subject to a lot of regulation. At the same time, we have a trade policy and a custom policy, which allows, just to give an example, China to send any parcel that's worth less than 150 euros into Europe, right? So we've had more than 4.6 billion parcels delivered to Europe last year. These products, 70% of them are found to be faulty products. This includes, for instance, children's toys. So how dare we put all these rules and regulations on our own companies while doing basically nothing and practicing liberal orthodoxy for countries that are not in our regulatory remit? I just think this doesn't make sense anymore. And so my message is more regulation is not better regulation. And if you want to have regulation, you need to really be able to apply it across the board, because otherwise what you're de facto doing is disadvantaging our own companies. And that is not what public policy is for.
Would you have power to apply it across the board? Because I can imagine that to be a regulatory superpower, you also have to be an economic superpower. You have to be a technological superpower.
That's
Otherwise,
what I'm saying. That's exactly. I remember these arguments back in the day when I was still at the Commission and saying, I mean, who sets the standard for social media platforms? It's not Brussels. It's a social media platform that says you got to be 16, but I will not actually enforce this. I will not ask you to verify this. So it's the adoption of technology that basically sets the standard, right? So if we think that we sit here in Brussels and we drop all these regulations and the world will just follow while our sort of economic underpinning is eroding, our industrial base is eroding, we are fooling ourselves, right? So something's got to give. I mean, we need more realism in how this works in practice.
We've seen the watering down of the corporate sustainability due diligence directive. Is this the right way to boost competitiveness, or does it risk undermining Europe's leadership on sustainability? Doesn't it punish companies that actually invested in meeting higher standards?
Policy made in Brussels has basically done two things. It has significantly increased the cost of doing business in Europe. So you have to remember that regulation always carries a cost, a compliance cost. You got to do something, right? So our companies have the world's highest compliance costs, the highest cost of energy, the highest cost of wages, highest cost of non-wage labor costs, the highest taxes, okay? So this is what we're doing, right? So we have priced ourselves in many instances out of the market,
Yeah.
including our own market, because there's a reason why we buy Chinese, right? Then at the same time, what these policies have done, because even though we say we have these values, the biggest value of all seems to be price, which is why we always go for the cheapest price, which no longer are European companies. So de facto, we have made our own companies totally dependent on China, completely dependent. So after doing this for many years, decades, one may say, we turn around and say, but now you got to show us that you have a picture-perfect supply chain.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Mm.
Does that make sense? I understand the frustration of many companies that have just said, it's enough. It's enough. Think about what I told you in the beginning. These companies are every single day in global competition. And not only are we not helping our own companies, we're making it worse for them in many instances, right? And this is why I think the CSDDD needs to go, at least at this point, because A, you cannot enforce it. There is no legal instance in Europe that can really validate a supply chain, I don't know, in China or in Peru or wherever. This will open up our companies to so many legal challenges. We've already seen some of this. We had a farmer in Peru press charges against RWE, which is a big German utility, saying it caused climate change. I mean, you want this times 1,000, you pass the CSDDD. So no to CSDDD, including for big companies, at least not at this point. We need to give our corporate base at this point really a chance to recover, because it's been too much.
On 19 November, the European Commission proposed retreating from the EU's data and privacy rules and AI regulation. The so-called digital omnibus proposal includes modifications to GDPR, the AI Act, and other recent legislation. What are main pitfalls of this proposal, and would they affect citizens' privacy in a meaningful way?
So on digital, I mean, just sort of a reality check. Europe is subject, despite GDPR, to major cyber vulnerabilities, and I'm speaking major. We have industrial scale espionage in Europe, espionage. Yeah, so I'm really, this idea that the GDPR has really sort of saved us from much is I think is too simplistic. So I want to be clear, I'm not against the GDPR. However, if I had to date back, when did Europe's economic problems really start in earnest? And I am someone who's been around long enough to know a Europe that was a global technology leader, a Europe that the rest of the world looked to for breakthroughs, for really just amazing innovation, than it was when the digital revolution started. And basically, Europe never understood how transformative this was going to be. So we put this blanket suspicion sort of working with data, right? Data privacy became the gospel. But as I always used to say, I mean, data privacy in the absence of data security just doesn't, it can't work, right? But why do we have, I am convinced that why do we have this focus on data privacy is you basically only need lawyers to draw up this regulation. Whereas data security, you really need the hardcore techies, right? You really need technology expertise that, frankly, I mean, most public administrations simply don't possess, right? So it was easy to do when the GDPR passed. I was while I worked at the Commission, and there was, I mean, this Brussels effect, and we're so proud of this. But I would always say, show me the money. I mean, where are any companies in Europe that are actually, turning into global champions because of this? We don't have a single European hyperscaler that compares to what are called the glorious seven in the United States. And of course, China then during that time proved that they were able to stand up these digital champions, which we never could. So I think it's too simple to just say we are so proud of the GDPR. And to be clear, also, in other geographies, people take data privacy seriously. Also, in the United States, people don't want their health data or their financial data in the public domain. So clearly, I mean, there are also elsewhere safeguards for data privacy, but they are done in a way where you didn't sort of destroy the digital economy as a sort of collateral damage. So I think we need to rethink how we do things. We need to not regulate before we're even in the game, which is very much what we did with GDPR. And we need to understand that technologies build on one another. So for me, it was almost funny during my time in the Commission when AI came along, artificial intelligence, it sounded so good, right? And everyone was like, we want to be leaders in artificial intelligence. But I'm like, but you just created this completely, unworkable data regime, which basically doesn't allow for companies to work with data, to repurpose data, to really, because this is what AI is. It's the aggregation of large volumes of data. This is where the intelligence comes from. So I'm like, I can pretty much tell you today, we're not going to be leaders in AI simply. So technologies build on one another. We see it now, for instance, in AI as well, which is highly dependent on energy. We never made that connection between energy and AI. So it's what we need to understand is there's a cumulative effect that if you lose out in one technology, even if you can't see it at the time, there will probably be spillover effects in other areas of technology where you will then not be a leader.
But so, in short, you then think that the Commission is on the right track with this digital omnibus? Is it tackling the right issues in the right way?
Yes, I think it is correct not to push through the AI Act now. We need to keep in mind that every single company, a European company, that matters in the space of AI, be it Siemens, be it Mistral, be it Siemens Energy, they wrote a letter together saying, put this thing on ice. Let's not again regulate before we know what we're doing. So I think we need to take this seriously.
Yeah. What would you respond to those who argue that this digital omnibus and omnibus in general and scaling back the oversight could benefit American and Chinese companies most of all? It's one of the arguments that we hear a lot in press.
I mean, there are always arguments here and there. I would say that the omnibus alone is probably not enough. There will be in the forthcoming Industrial Accelerator Act, which is coming forward very soon, a Made in Europe provision. So I think the omnibus, together with a Made in Europe provision, could work. It's not a panacea, the omnibus, because what I always like to say is Europe is not just over-regulated. Europe is also over-governed. Because I saw it really during my time when I worked with clean tech startups that wanted to scale. I mean, remember, this was during the Green Deal. This is when we wanted to be climate leaders, and these were climate technologies. And I saw that it was impossible in Europe because when energy is very regional, so you start out at a regional level. You need a permit or something, right? So you're dealing with the regional authorities. but a lot of regulation is at the national level, right? So you're dealing also with the national level. But then a lot is actually at the European level as well, right? And be it subsidies in clean energy, you really can't do anything without a subsidy in most instances when you get started. So then you have the privilege of working with colleagues at DG Competition or DG Anna. So my point is, I saw that for startups, this is a level of complexity because you have just lots and lots of people who want to have a say, but you don't have a single person who can really unblock anything. So we can always talk a good game, but we can't make things happen. We can't operationalize. We can't implement. And this is my challenge really is a lot of these regulations get underway with good intentions. I don't question that. I also want Europe to be a leader in the highest standards. But then when you see what it results in, it's sometimes very sobering.
The European Green Deal was a key set of policies that was adopted in the first tenure of the President von der Leyen. Nowadays, it is being criticized even by the center right. Is the EU policy going from the extreme to the extreme, or would you actually say that these adjustments are reasonable?
Well, I think you heard me speak earlier about realism because a Green Deal that doesn't have sort of positive economic spillovers is not really a deal, right? And I mean, this was towards the end of the Green Deal. I think people were rightly questioning, like, where's the business case, right? Because when it started, we were promised that this was the new growth agenda, and I think there were a lot of sort of assumptions about how this was going to play out, and it didn't. I mean, we need to be fair, right? It didn't pan out the way we anticipated. So this fast forward is now the clean industrial deal, right? Which I do think is more pragmatic because obviously no one has signed up for decarbonization through deindustrialization, which is basically what we were getting, right? So it's very important not to demonize industry, but to work with industry in the decarbonization. And here to say that industry suffers. There's no other way to say it, suffers, particularly from the high cost of energy.
Yes.
So it's in the interest of industry to decarbonize, but we need to give them the tools to do so, because if you get off fossil energy, if you become more productive, if you repurpose industrial heat, if you do all these things and you deploy new technologies, you will be able to ultimately lower cost, and decarbonization is basically a side product. But for that, a lot of things need to happen. So you need to incentivize industry basically to transition away from fossil energy. You need to encourage industry startup collaboration. It's my experience that oftentimes really the technology frontier resides in startups, but they cannot scale unless industry buys their solutions, right? So we, as a part and parcel of European industrial policy, should do much more to bring industry together with startups and also with academia to really create ecosystems where new solutions could take place. We need, I am convinced, new funding instruments. I am personally very excited about the new Scale Up Europe Fund, which really sort of targets what has been a missing piece, namely growth finance. So we have oftentimes the instruments in place to help get companies off the ground, but they can't grow because there isn't the kind of scale-up finance that they need. There isn't the kind of offtake that can only come from industry and, by the way, through public procurement from governments. So we need to rethink sort of the system itself rather than tell ourselves, here's a green regulation and it'll all fall into place because I have these targets. And, it doesn't work like that.
And you spoke a lot about the cost and the burden of doing business in Europe. The IMF estimates that internal barriers in the EU impose tariff equivalent costs of 45% for goods and 110% for services, which is several times higher than external tariffs. Why has completing the single market, including the banking union and the capital markets union, proven so difficult?
I would say it's a combination. Politically, it has not been on the front burner in a long, long time.
Why? Was it
Well,
underestimated the importance of it?
honest. I mean, look at the people who make regulations and who set political priorities. It hasn't been a priority, you know. If they could choose between, let's have a new, sort of institutional convention, and open the treaties or have big debates about deepening versus widening. Yeah, I think, or having more regulations or more this and that, they would have chosen that. There aren't a lot of people in town who care about economy, who care about business. I mean, I've been here almost 25 years. I can say it with confidence that that is the case. So it hasn't been a priority. I have heard my time in the commission many, many times, including at a very high level, no one loves the single market, right? Which is probably true. But I tell you that people love economic decline and marginalization even less. So I think it's time to rediscover what makes Europe Europe. And the only thing that really puts us on the global map is this market. I remember when I was at the European Commission, and issues of sovereignty were coming up for the first time, because even then we were palpably losing sovereignty. And I gave a presentation about sovereignty, and I said, what gives us sovereignty is this market, is because we don't have hard power. We don't have a European army, right? It's people want access to this market, right? So this is what gives us sovereignty. But we have never seen it. I think from that perspective, we have needlessly given access to that market without asking for anything in return in many instances. We have not used that market strategically. And this is also why internally it's so fragmented, even though we're supposed to have a single market. It hasn't been a priority. So I would say it's a combination of politicians who really just simply didn't care. And it's, of course, also a fact that there are a lot of vested interests who benefit from this fragmentation, right? We're going through this now with the so-called 28th regime, which is a single corporate registration at a European level, a digital one, which would allow you to do business across the EU. And the big question is it a regulation or a directive?
Hmm.
And there are very forceful voices that want it to be a directive, i.e., notaries, because notaries make a lot of money from this fragmentation in Europe. Because if you have to set up in each and every member state you want to do business, every time a notary will collect something. So we need to be really strategic. We need to now just do what's right for the economy, and we need to use this market very strategically for ourselves, and need to use it much more as a bargaining chip with others.
Are you hopeful that the 28th regime will go forward?
It better go forward. I mean,
In a way.
I've been around a long time, and I have to say kudos to the organizers, EU Incorporated, because it's the most disciplined effort I have ever seen. In the past, there were oftentimes fragmentations also between this startup association versus that one. They all came together and really pushed this through. They thought through the legal pitfalls. They had it drawn up. It's been very formidable. If this is not delivered as a regulation and very soon, then honestly, we should just bury any pretense that we are trying to regain competitiveness.
All right. Very briefly, now the final question. Looking ahead, what would be your top 3 recommendations for the EU leadership? You've talked about it a lot already, but
Yeah. Well, this is frankly a very difficult question because there's so much to say here. I mean, number one, I would say don't have a principle, right? Rather than 300 sort of Draghi initiatives, just have a basic principle. don't treat our own companies, our own European companies, worse than their international competitors. Because what we have done is simply because they were in our regulatory remit, we just piled it on while basically practicing sort of liberal orthodoxy for third countries, right?
I mean, why was it stemming from, the
It's
sheer
because we have a supranational power in trade and in competition, and that was used to maximum effect. I really believe that our economists and the economic profession have misguided us. I really can't say it any other way because there is an underlying assumption that there is competitive advantage. So the idea was if China can do it cheaper, then we should buy from China. But the economists have never helped us draw up a program that would allow Europe to move up the value chain. I mean, the only program we had was the Lisbon Agenda, which was if you compare the Lisbon Agenda to China 2025 or the Chinese 5-year plans, it's a joke. I mean, there's no other way of saying it, right? So we basically said, okay, it's fine to buy from China, and all of these goods came in, oftentimes subsidized, without any scrutiny. We had no trade. We had no trade agreement. There was oftentimes no reciprocity. You know, we were not allowed to invest in infrastructure in China. We would not have been able to buy up ports or lay down the digital infrastructure the way we allowed it to be, right? So we had no plan, and we kept the markets wide open. We denied our own companies oftentimes subsidies, even though we knew that very heavily subsidized products came in from China into our own markets. I witnessed this myself when it came to 5G. In 5G, we had two players. We had Nokia and Ericsson, but they couldn't prove basically market failure. In Europe, the threshold to give a subsidy is you have to prove market failure. But this is A, not easy to prove, and B, it doesn't work at all, this regime, for emerging technologies, because obviously if you're trying to stand up a new technology, there's no market failure because there's no market, right? So we never really thought this through. So it was really, that's why I'm saying these are long-standing issues, and I feel that the powers that Brussels had on trade and in competition, they just used to maximum effect base, but not in favor always of our own companies, but of the companies of third countries. And it's only now, very recently, that some of this is being rethought, and that we have a foreign subsidies regime that where now we look more carefully. But to be clear, I want to say, in the case of China, this is no longer just about subsidies. They're ahead in innovation and technology, and in industry and in automation, so this is not easy to catch up on. They really put their money where their mouth is. So they invest in strategic technologies. They invest a lot in R&D. They value their science and their research, and they're super strategic. I mean, the government works hand in glove oftentimes with companies. They use their own market to unleash enormous competition between Chinese companies. What does competition do? It basically increases productivity and it drives down the cost. So all of that is a masterclass that we have never been able to replicate here. So I really think from the way we have done economic policy making, it needs a major rethink and really a new approach. And if I can just say this, we need to start pricing in security, dependency, sovereignty. I said we priced ourselves out of the market by buying cheap, but by buying cheap, actually, we have increased the cost to ourselves enormously. We did the same mistake with Russian natural gas. We're doing it again, in many domains. So we really need much more sophisticated policy planning and policy making. So my second priority would really be around the single market, but not the way we've done it today, but really understanding the single market as an economic project with huge geopolitical and security ramifications. If we do not make the single market work better, if we don't use it more strategically, then there is no way we will be able to recover economically. There is no way that others in the world will take us seriously, right? Because this is the one thing we have. I spoke earlier that we don't have a European army. We don't have hard power. But we do have that market, and that's the only thing that's really putting us on the global map. So please, 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 let's not only see it as an economic project, but really as a strategic security, strategic resilience type project. So what that means in practice is the capital markets union, or what is called now the savings and investment union, has to happen. This is no longer optional. This would be, for me, priority number one, right? I mean, that you really have liquid capital markets, and that you, over time, be able to progressively crowd in also institutional investment. We know that a lot of our institutional investors and family offices actually invest in the United States, right? It makes no sense. If we could really create the conditions where it makes sense to invest in Europe, because companies can not only start, but can actually grow big. And for that, we need the single market. A lot of capital would flow into Europe. So for me, there is a sequencing here, but the first step needs to be to really say the savings and investment union is the overriding priority. It's the key building block towards a more resilient, a more secure Europe. So there's a lot coming together here, because I think one of the real challenges we face is that a lot of the economic policymakers never look at these issues from a security and geopolitical perspective. But by all means, they're interwoven, right? So that's number one. Secondly, also linked to that, before I get to my third point, we know that basically going forward, all of the economic growth, or most of the economic growth, will take place outside of Europe. So of course we need vehicles to tap into that. I personally think we need like a geo-industrial deal, so not just a clean or industrial deal in Europe, but a geo-industrial deal outside of Europe, where we really also help our companies set foot in the world's fastest growing markets. And if we do that, by the way, we will do a lot also to fight climate change, because we know that our European companies work to a higher standard, more energy efficiency, more sustainability built in. So the more we can bring this to fast growing countries, the better it is. My third and final point is that, and I'm sorry to be so blunt, we cannot screw up basically a rearmament of Europe. And I say it as someone who's been through digital, who's been through the Green Deal and clean tech. A lot of money was spent. And now the new priority is defense and security. We need to make sure that that money is spent in ways that actually makes us more secure and resilient, right? So for that, we need to understand that this type of warfare, I often describe between a mixture between World War I and World War III. I think we're actually more sort of knowledgeable about World War I, not very knowledgeable about World War III, right? Which is all about defense tech innovation. And here, it really, really is important that we understand where is the technology frontier, that we invest in the startups that are doing this. And it's a moving target, right? And we know, for instance, that in defense procurement, it takes ages, right? So by the time they procure something, the technology is oftentimes already obsolete. So if we don't do this the right way, we will be spending a lot of money in ways that not only will not make us more secure, but may actually really expose us to a lot of security risks. So we need to get this right. And I am very worried that a lot of the debate right now is just about spending more, but not a lot of discussions about how to spend, right? So we really need to have this conversation. And here we need to talk to people who operate at the technology frontier, who really understand what is happening. So I've been advocating for a defense tech innovation council of some kind, right? I mean, that really brings in that expertise that can also be consulted in the case that this hybrid war becomes even more dangerous, which it certainly will at this point. And my very last point is, let's not drop the ball on Ukraine. This is not a one-way street. We're helping Ukraine. We need Ukraine to help us. Ukraine, coming back to defense tech innovation, there is no better global leader than Ukraine. I mean, this is when it comes to the production of drones and really being able to scale up manufacturing in times of war. We have a lot to learn from Ukraine. So the closer we can bring Ukraine to us right now, the better. For me personally, I would give Ukraine the digital dossier, the defense dossier. I mean, they really have handled things superbly well. Ukraine was able to grow its digital economy even during a wartime. We have so much to learn from that country. So it's really important that we continue to focus on Ukraine, and we really need to internalize that our own security is completely dependent on how this war will play out. So the stakes are extremely high. In fact, I would argue they couldn't be higher. In my 25 years here, I've never seen a situation so serious. So this is really important that we get rearmament right.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for this extremely sober assessment of our needs and challenges, and giving all those three priorities, which I personally would very much sign up to. It was a terrific conversation, and thank you all for watching. We hope that you will stay tuned for our upcoming Europe Chats.